So last week, I ran the Shadow the Weird Wizard Quickplay for a group of friends, and I have some pretty mixed feelings on it, mostly with the Quickplay itself, less with the system, but let's just get into it. Firstly, if you're wondering what Shadow the Weird Wizard is, it's essentially a response to Shadow the Demon Lord, which was a response to 5e. Both Demon Lord and Weird Wizard are made by the same guy, Robert Schwalb, who was a designer on 5e. The best way for me to describe Shadow the Demon Lord, which I'll probably repeat myself when I do a why you should play Shadow the Demon Lord video, but essentially the best way I can describe Shadow the Demon Lord is if it's 5e but good, which is me being a little bit hyperbolic, especially these days as I'm a bit of a 5e defender because I do think a lot of people are just attacking it because it's, you know, the big thing, and a lot of people have finally learned that there's other systems out there, so in response they kind of just shit on 5e. 5e has a lot of issues. I do criticize a lot about it, but I do think what it tries to do, it does do well. Even so, I do feel like if you're looking for a good tactics game and a good game to make builds, Demon Lord is a fantastic game to go for, but I'll get to that in another video. And essentially the issue with Demon Lord that a lot of people have that I personally don't really have is that it's a bit too edgy and a bit too dark. So Weird Wizard is kind of updating a lot of those rules for its new systems and everything else, while also being a bit more neutral in tone so that you can go darker, you can go more, you know, D&D heroic, you can do whatever you want with it. Personally, I do find Demon Lord does have a lot of like edgy stuff in it, but I don't think it's as baked in as a lot of people say it is. It is baked into a lot of the spells and some of the backgrounds and that sort of thing, but personally, I don't think it's that hard to remove them from that. So if you are looking for a similar game to 5e and Weird Wizard is still a year out, I would check out Shadow the Demon Lord. So with that explanation out of the way, the quick play honestly doesn't really take a lot from Weird Wizard. It really felt to me like playing a Shadow the Demon Lord quick play. I do know from the playtest, which is different from the quick play, which essentially was a beta that came out for Weird Wizard like I think a year or two ago now, and that had a bunch of different things in it on the different paths and all that, and the quick play is really just a short little thing to just get a game going as fast as possible. A lot of the paths in the Weird Wizard playtest had a lot of these like token systems that a lot of the paths followed. That's strangely absent from this. On the player side, there is one NPC that does have those, but overall it does feel like it's not really taking advantage of what's making Weird Wizard different from Shadow the Demon Lord. I'm not really sure what the reasoning is for that. Maybe just make it as easy as possible. This is really a cut down version as best it can be, which also creates new problems, which we'll get into. To give you a breakdown of this video, first we're gonna go over some of the rules. I'm not gonna go over all of them, just a few that I find are interesting or worth talking about. If you do want to deep dive into the rules yourself, the quick play is free, so you can go to drive-thru or wherever else it's offered and just download for free and look at it yourself. One of the reasons why I love Demon Lord and Weird Wizard follows this is that a lot of the rules are just kind of self-explanatory. They take the base core mechanics and then they just kind of make sense. When I ran a Demon Lord campaign, the amount of times I made a ruling that ended up just being the rule happened, I think, pretty much every time. It's a really, really easy system to run. Not that it's not crunchy, just that it has less crunch than 5e, and the rules that are there all just kind of make sense. And then after the rules, we're gonna go over the characters, and after the characters, we're gonna look at the adventure that comes with the quick play. I will give a spoiler warning when we get there. Before we get to that point, there's not gonna be any spoilers for anything, or at least I'm gonna try to avoid them as best I can, but I will give a spoiler warning later on before we do the adventure. So, for the Weird Wizard, for the rules, you have a very simple system. You're mostly just gonna need d20s and d6s, unless you have some weird stuff, like some things that use d3s. This system uses essentially only d20s and d6s, which I quite like. I do like the d20s and d6s because those are dice that most people have. Maybe not the d20s, but if anybody does have a non-d6 die, there's a good chance it's a d20. So it's very easy to get even casual players invested because almost everybody has d6s at their house. It's better than, you know, DCC's weird dice. D&D dice in general are not the most common thing for casual or, you know, non-RPG players. But I like this system the way I like any other ones. If I'm in the mood for a DCC thing with random DCC dice, I like it. If I'm in the mood for like COC with the D100 dice, I'm into it. If I'm in a mood for this kind of game, then I'm into it. I'm not somebody who prefers one method over another when it comes to dice. It really is more just a mood-based thing, and as long as they're all done well. But this is a very simple system. You have 4 attributes that you roll for, so whenever you're doing attribute rolls, you just go off of one of those 4 attributes. The core attributes are strength, agility, intellect, and will, so you have 2 physical and 2 mental. Every roll you do will be based off of those except for luck checks, which is just a flat d20 unless you have any modifiers that change that. All damage dice are d6s, and the other cool thing you have as part of the core rules are boons and banes, and essentially the way boons and banes work are that they are d6s you add to any roll you're doing. Boons are good, banes are bad, and they either add or take away from the roll. The only thing is that you only add the highest of whatever you have. So if you roll 3 boons, and you roll a 6, a 5, and a 2, you just add that 6 to your d20. You don't add the 6, 5, and 2 all together to the d20 roll. Every boon and bane cancel each other out, so if you have 3 boons and 2 banes, you just roll with 1 boon. It's a very simple system. It does work similarly to Advantage in 5e, but I do prefer the system because environmental things will add boons and banes, abilities, spells, and all sorts of random things will add them, and I do find it's pretty easy just marking one off for the other. It was a system in Shadow the Demon Lord that works really well, and it works really well here. So the next thing I want to talk about is damage and health, because I do think this will confuse some people. The way it works in the quick play is fairly similar to how it works in Demon Lord. I'm not going to say it's the exact same because I could be wrong on that, but it's pretty close to it. And the reason why I'm covering this is that I think the quick play tries to do a good job of covering it, and it kind of ends up over-explaining and making it more confusing. I looked over it with the players and we all came to the same conclusion, but it was one of those things where we all kind of had to reread it 2 or 3 times to totally understand what it was trying to go for. So essentially the way health and damage works is that health and damage are tracked separately. Your damage starts at 0, and when you take damage, you just add to that number until it reaches your health score, and then you're incapacitated. And then when you're incapacitated, you roll a d6 every round, and that's how much health you lose. And when your health reaches 0, you die. Now the thing is though, every round after you roll that d6, you roll a luck check, and if you pass it, then you come back up with 1 damage less than your new health score. So to explain what I mean by that, if you got into combat and you had 10 health, let's say you fight some orcs, and then you just keep getting your ass beat until finally you take 10 damage. Then you go down, and then on your first round, you roll a d6 health, let's say it goes down by 2, so your new health score is 8, but you pass your luck check. So you're back up with 7 damage out of 8 health instead of the 10 health that you had before. And that's pretty much it. If you're incapacitated and creatures attack you, whatever damage they do, you take that away from your health score. And when your health finally reaches 0, you're dead for good. So it is a pretty simple system, but I do think the way it's explained in the book is a little bit tricky. And I also do think with such a similar system to things you're probably used to, having it just be different enough will confuse a lot of people. So just make sure your players are tracking damage and not bringing their health down, because otherwise there will be some confusion and frustration. Okay, the next thing I'm going to talk about is combat. I'm not really going to talk about a lot of the combat stuff. Like I said, you can get this book yourself and look through all the different things. The combat is very similar to what you're used to with Worlds Without Number or D&D, where, you know, you have different action types and you have different moves and all that sort of stuff. I'm just gonna talk about one major thing that's different in this quick play than it is in Demon Lord. The one thing I do want to talk about is the initiative system and the way things run in a combat round. In Demon Lord, at the beginning of each round, the players called out what they want to do, either a fast action or a slow action. The only difference is that fast action is just 1 action and a slow action is moving and an action. It might be some other stuff too, with like they're doing like 2 actions, or if like an ability says on a slow action you can do this, whatever it might be. But in general, that's the basic difference, is that either just 1 action or moving and doing an action. And the way it worked was it'd be player fast actions, enemy fast actions, player slow actions, enemy slow actions, and then it just goes right back up. And I love that system. It makes combat go so fast and people are never really confused as to when they're going. So it actually made things go by so fast that a lot of players are like, whoa, this is going so fast, I don't really have time to actually think about what I want to do in the next round. So not that it's an issue, because obviously once you get there, players can stop and then talk about what they want to do, but it really was one of those things where you don't have that everybody rolls a d20 and kind of goes around in turns, and then people have time to think about what they're going to do before it gets to them. It kind of just goes bam, 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 bam. It was really easy to do. I never got confused running it, and it made combat just move so smoothly. So the difference in this game is that there are no slow or fast actions. At least in the quick play, I don't know what the final product is going to be, but the quick play is meant to be a good representation of what players should be getting used to. So if that is that different, I do think it's a bad call, but just for this sake, the differences are that there are no slow or fast actions, and enemies go first. It's honestly a lot more like the old school D&D kind of way of doing initiative, where one side goes and the other side goes. The only difference being that the enemies go first every time and then the players go. And what this leads to is an interesting thing where what the players can do is using their reaction to seize the initiative, which is a move they can do where they actually go before the enemies go, but at the expense of their reaction being lost. So that means they can't take attacks of opportunity, or if they have an ability that uses a reaction, they can't use that because they're using it for this instead. I do think it adds a little bit of a tactical element to it that I do like, and I also did find that, at least in Shadow the Demon Lord, there were a lot of times where if the players went first, they were kind of demolishing encounters really fast, and which is not like a problem with the system. That could have just been my own, encounter design. Also, the encounter in question also matters, because some of them they did take a while to actually beat, other ones they just demolished. I do like the enemies going first, because I feel like as a GM that gives you a better time to actually set up in combat a good sort of design. Because sometimes when you have combats in these kinds of games, specifically Worlds Without Number or Shadow the Demon Lord, players going first are going to go first can sometimes not, I don't want to say ruin your plans, but you might have tried to make something interesting that might just get ruined and create a pretty boring or easy combat when you want to be a bit more dynamic or interesting. So having enemies go first is kind of nice. And if the players do want to go first to try and disrupt that, they do have a little bit of a cost to get ahead in doing those things. I like both systems. I'm not sure which one I prefer. I am interested to see what the final product is going to use, if it's going to use sort of a mix of the Demon Lord system and this newer system, or if they're just going to keep it as is and that's how it's going to work. I think both work pretty well, but I also think that you could probably implement Shadow the Demon Lord if you don't like this one, because I love the Demon Lord one. I think it just moves things so smoothly. The more games I play, and this is not me trying to shit on 5e because DCC does the exact same one, the more I find other initiative systems, I do think everybody rolling their own d20 and then going around by that is probably the worst way to do it. Stefan Surratt, who's been on the show before, actually has a pretty good system that he uses. I'm not sure where he heard it from or if he made it himself, but it's very elegant, which is everybody rolls their d20s and whoever has the highest, they go first and then you just go clockwise that way. And that's pretty much everything I want to talk about when it comes to the mechanics of the game. There's obviously a bunch of other things that are in there, but like I said, most of it's pretty self-explanatory or just not that interesting to talk about. So this quick play comes with 5 characters. We only used 4 because I ran it for 4 people. Also, one thing that one of my players noticed was that these are also the characters that are on the Shadow the Weird Wizard cover. So that's pretty fun to actually have a little bit of art of who you're playing as, which I like. I'm not going to go over Soldier 5 too much because that was the one that we didn't use. He's like a clockwork fighter. Pretty basic character, has a lot of the fun stuff that Clockworks and Demon Lord had, so I'm sure it's a totally fine build. What we had were Crunk, Zaya, Aim, and Whisper. I'm going to go over Crunk and Whisper first because I have a lot less to go over with them, and then I'm going to go over Aim and Zaya because there's some issues between those two. So the first one is Crunk, who's essentially just this big-ass Yeti character. It looks like a big bugbear or Sasquatch or Yeti kind of character, you know, just a 8-foot-tall, 400-pound hairy boy. And his big thing is that he beats ass hard with his hammer. He adds a boon to strength attribute rolls, and he can also add banes on ones opposed against him. I'm gonna go back 1 second just to explain some rules that I forgot to mention in the rule section. You always make attribute rolls against DC 10 unless anything changes that, but usually what you're doing is imposing boons and banes on the character, so that DC 10 stays the same usually. It's usually outside modifiers that make it hard to get that 10. So it's a very simple system to usually remember, okay, all I need is DC 10. Whenever they make a roll, they're just trying to beat 10. Unless you have anything that you think really makes that a different DC. If circumstances would make it harder or easier, it's better to give the player a boon or a bane than changing the 10, because then you can always just try and remember it's 10, that's all they need to roll to get. The only time that's different is when they're making an attribute roll against a character, and then you just roll against whatever that character's attribute is. So if a character's like casting a spell and has to make a will roll against an enemy, just look at whatever their will score is, and then they just have to roll that or higher. But going back to Crunk now, he can make strength rolls, or he can impose banes on others making strength rolls against him. When he crits, he does extra damage, and a crit is when you get 20 or higher, and the difference between what you rolled and what their defense is 5. So if you rolled a 22 to attack and their defense is 12, you rolled 10 over their score and over 20, so that's a crit, so you add an extra d6 to the damage. But when Crunk crits, he rolls the damage dice twice and takes the higher one. And he also has Engage the Enemy, which is essentially he can use as a reaction to move up towards an enemy and make an attack if they move within his space. So a pretty simple beefy boy that just hits really hard. Very simple character. Next you have a Whisper, who's just this edgy elf rogue character, you know, very classic archetype. None of them are breaking any new ground. This is just a system that is trying to get a 5e crowd, so having these archetypes that are classic is probably a pretty good call. Whisper's main thing is that they do extra damage when they have a boon, and they also have an ability that gives them a boon on 1 attribute roll per turn. So if they use that on the attack, they get the extra boon, they get the extra damage. However, if they use that ability that gives them a boon for something else, they can't use that round. They have an ability that makes them good at sneaking, and then they also just have a dagger, short sword, longbow. But outside that, there's not really much else to talk about with Whisper. They're a pretty classic character. I'm not going to spend any more time on them. The next 2 characters we have are Zaya the Cleric and Aim the Wizard. And the reason why I'm talking about these 2 is that there seems to be a pretty massive disparity between these 2 characters. And the first disparity is the spells. Zaya doesn't have any spells. They do have 2 magical traditions, Invocation and Protection, whereas Aim has Aeromancy and Skullduggery. Aim has 4 spells they can use, some of them multiple times a day. Zaya doesn't have any. I don't know if that's a mistake, or if they just don't get it yet, or what, but it feels very weird that they have 2 magic traditions, but no actual magic. Outside of that, Zaya has some abilities they can use in combat to buff other people. Some of them can only be used once per day, others can be used every round. A lot of them either add buffs to the characters or add debuffs to enemies trying to attack those characters. For example, you have Battle Blessing, which says, you can use an action or a reaction when you attack to grant yourself and each ally within 5 yards 1 boon on rolls to attack for 1 minute. Until this effect ends, the targets are also immune to the Frightened Affliction. Once you use this talent, you lose access to it for 1 minute. So that Battle Blessing is once per combat. And then you also have like Prayer, which is you can use a reaction when you or a creature within 5 yards makes an attribute roll to magically grant 1 boon to the roll. So that's sort of like a bless. You have those and you have a few other ones, but the big thing is the Holy Symbol. So the Holy Symbol has 1 charge, and it allows you to do one of 3 things. A Holy Smite, which adds 3d6 damage. A Holy Healing, which you can heal 1 character for 3d6 healing. And then there's also Holy Denunciation, which is kind of like Turn Unholy, but you can use it on other creatures as well. You roll with 1 boon if it is classic Turn Unholy kind of creatures, but you can use it on Aimbody for them to be held. So I want you to hold on to that, and I'm going to go through what Aim has. Firstly, Aim is a Dragonette, which is essentially just a miniature dragon, so it has a fly speed. It has a magic ring that holds 2 charges. It does lose the ability to fly while it's injured. It has a prehensile tail, which you can use to wield offhand weapons. You have a magic sense that you can use over and over again. They also have harness lightning, which is you can use an action to call down a bolt of lightning to strike you, but rather than being harmed, you become energized for 1 hour or until you end this effect. The effect also ends if you become unconscious. Once you use this magical talent, you lose access to it until after you rest. This talent grants you the following benefits. You take no damage from lightning. You emit dim light. Any creature that touches you or deals damage to you with a weapon made of metal makes a luck roll. On a failure, the creature takes 1d6 damage. When you attack with a natural weapon or an unarmed strike, you roll with 1 boon against metal targets and targets wearing medium or heavy armor. Your attacks with natural weapons, unarmed strikes, and metal weapons deal 1d6 damage from the lightning in addition to the normal damage. You can use an action to hurl lightning at 1 creature or object within 20 yards. Make an intellect or will roll against the target's agility. You roll with 1 boon against a metal target or a target wearing medium or heavy armor. On a success, the target takes 46 damage. Once you use this aspect of this talent, you lose access to it for 1 minute. So that's the harness lightning stuff, and then you can also hide in plain sight. You can use an action to become hidden for 1 hour. You ignore the requirements for becoming hidden. The effect ends early if you harm another creature, run, or speak at a volume greater than a whisper. You can use this talent once. You regain the use after you rest. And then you can use that implement, that ring I mentioned earlier. It has 2 charges. You can use your implement to produce either of the following effects by expending 1 charge provided you wield or wear it. So you can either Mage Shield, which is as an action or a reaction when you are attacked, impose 1 bane on rolls against your defense and agility for 1 minute, or you can Mage Strike, which is, as an action, launch a missile of magical energy at 1 creature or object within 10 yards. Make an intellect or will roll against the target's agility. On a success, the target takes 2d6 damage. On top of that, you also have Fire Breath, which is not that great. It's 1 target only and does a d6, but is another thing you can do. And also, it's a type of damage that's different than attacking with just a weapon, so that could also be helpful. But we're not done yet, because you also have 4 spells. These can all be cast once, unless said otherwise. Danger Sense, which is pretty self-explanatory. You can only cast once. Flee the Scene, you can use a reaction to cast a spell when you become injured. You can cast a spell 3 times. You also have Forked Lightning, which is a lightning spell where you can either target 1 or 2 creatures and you do lightning damage. You can cast a spell once. And there's also Gusting Wind, which you can cast 3 times, which allows you to target a size 5 space within 30 yards. For 1 minute, strong wind blows into the target space for the duration. Any creature that ends its turn in the target's face makes a strength roll. On a failure, the creature falls prone and then becomes strength impaired until the end of its next turn. So you can see that this caster has a hell of a lot more than the other caster. And I think that's fine for wizards, because wizards should have more than other casters usually. Mostly because, you know, they don't have a high defense or they falter on other things. Whereas Zaya has like a really good defense, has good health, so it makes up for those things. But I still think it creates a disparity between the 2 different casters, and we felt that in play. I'm not somebody who cares about balance, but I do care about player versus player balance. Not always, but in general, most players tend to be people who kind of want to be balanced with other people in their party, or be really good at the thing they're choosing to be good at. And it really feels like Zaya is definitely lower on the rung than Aim is for what they're trying to do. However, I do think there are some fixes. What I would say is make the Holy Healing separate from needing the Holy Symbol charge, and just let it be an ability you can do 3 times a day. Or I would say give the Holy Symbol 3 charges, and let them do each one of those things once: Holy Smite, Holy Healing, or Holy Denunciation. Or just give them the 3 charges and let them pick between themselves what they want to do between those 3. Because the player who played Zaya did have fun, but they were mentioning that they were a bit unsatisfied with how they only had the 1 charge. And they were obviously going to hold onto it for the healing, because a lot of the combat in the quick play meant that, like, if I use it for anything else, like, if we don't heal the person who went down, they're going to have essentially no other way of actually getting their health back up. Because Zaya also has a poultice, which is for healing. Except in the quick play, They don't say how much a poultice does. If you're gonna have things in your quick play, you need the rules as to how they work. I believe in the playtest it says like a poultice adds like double the hit points for every hour of rest you do or something like that. In this, I just said it does a d6 of healing because there were no rules for what a poultice does in the quick play, which seems like a huge oversight. So those are the characters we used. I still think Zaya is a viable character. I'm not saying it's like, oh, she's not the meta, you can't use her. I'm just saying that like, I do think if you're going to have two casters, having one that is literally a full page and then the other one is just like half a page and it feels like they're missing a lot of stuff, like I said, the spells, it just feels like with Zaya, with no rules for the poultice and no spells, it feels like this was rushed out, or it feels like I'm missing something. I'm not sure what, but the quick play is meant to be all-encompassing, just a good introduction to your system, and I do think it's a really, really bad thing to have what feels like either an unfinished or a mistaken quick play. So I do think they should probably make a second version of this they put out on the same file, because you can just do that with drive-through, and fill out Zaya properly, or change some things to make Zaya a little bit more usable. I don't know. But those are the characters. We are going to get into the quick play adventure now, so this is your spoiler warning. If you want to play this with your GM, or if you're planning to play this in some other time, don't go beyond this point, because we're going to get into spoiler territory for this adventure. Alright, so the adventure is called A Season of Hunger, and I think the overall premise is pretty good. I think a lot of it breaks down after that. And the reason why I think that is I didn't run this very well. And the reason why I didn't run it very well is because I tried running it rules as written, or, you know, adventure as written, however you want to say it. And the reason why I did that is because this is a game that is trying to take away from like the D&D pool of people. It's trying to suck in people that are just playing that game as an alternative of like, hey, are you having issues with how this game runs? Are you not liking certain things? Here's a game that's very similar. It has all the build stuff, has all these things, but it might also have things you like more, like a simpler rule system and, you know, streamline this or that, or more narrative elements, whatever it might be. So you might have a much higher number of people who are very green to RPGs, or they might be used to running the Wizards of the Coast, you know, grand campaigns and following those campaigns as they're written, and a lot less experience making their own stuff, or the usual OSR stuff of doing what you want with what's written. And I do think if you did run this as somebody who's new, you would not necessarily have the best time. I don't think this is a really well laid out game. So to give you the premise, there's a town called Stillwater. It's just a small, shitty little place. It has like 6 houses. It is a thing that one of my players pointed out, where it does feel a little bit grimdarky. It does feel like a little bit of Demon Lord kind of crept in, because not to get too nitpicky too quickly, but there is a level of like, why do people live here? There's nothing here. These are just people who are here for no reason other than we need a small little dirt farmer town. But the thing is that the whole point of the game is that they are getting a grain supply coming in, because they're going to starve this winter if they don't get it. And that grain supply caravan's been hit by bandits. And it is one of those things where there's not like a reason to be here. There's not like a lucrative silver mine or like a salt mine, or that there's like an old temple that like adventurers come through and spend money on things and then go to it. It really is just like, the pond here is choked with like algae and shit. The ground is more rock than soil and you can't grow much. It's like all these things are like, who the fuck would stay here? Who would live here? There is one person here where it makes sense why they're here, but it's also done in a really funny way, in my opinion. That's Harold Brewer, who is the quest giver. He's kind of like the de facto town leader because nobody else is really taking up the mantle. He doesn't want to be. He just kind of knows people rely on him, so he just sort of has risen up to that. But the reason why I find him funny is that the way he's described is just kind of humorous. This book goes off of the 5e thing, where anybody who is written down in brackets in bold, it says what their stat block is, which I didn't realize at first. So when I read this, the proprietor of the Stillwater Brewing Company, Harold Brewer, murderer, enjoyed some success with his small operation. It explains later in his bit that he's like a serial killer or something. But either way, it was just a really funny way to put that. And I find it funny that they just had like a murderer stat block and not like a Harold Brewer stat block, but it's whatever. I will also say now that murderer stat block is the only stat block that uses the token system from Weird Wizard. It's also a ridiculous fucking stat block. It's probably like the most beefy one here, except for like a horror that I'll talk about later. It's really funny that this guy is just so decked out with stuff. His stat block is ridiculous. So the premise is that there is this grain shipment that's coming in from another town, and that grain shipment got hit by these bandits who are currently staying at this like haunted tower in the area. Their plan is to use the grain to come to town with it and sort of act like heroes, while also sort of low-key extorting everybody to be like, hey, we're in charge now. We're going to start calling the shots here. We're heroes, so you better like us, but also, if you don't like us, we're just going to kill you and take over the town anyway. So you can take the nice option, or you can take the bad option. And outside the bandits, the other thing that's going on is there's this like group of goblins that are led by like this Chad goblin who's called the Great Mighty Thune, or like the High and Mighty Thune, something like that. And he's just this big goblin who's leading this little band, and they're kind of like a red herring, but also potential allies to help with the bandits. There's also this steading, which is essentially a ranch, which is going to get attacked by the bandits at some point. Alright, so the problems with this quick play, let's just get into it because there's quite a few. Firstly, there's not enough to do. This could have been on me a little bit in terms of making all the areas a bit too close together, so maybe not enough time was passing just to get between the different areas. That could have been totally on me. But there is a timeline of things. There's day 0 all the way to day 4, and different things happen for all those days. I feel like one thing you're going to want to do, depending on how you run this, is kind of crunch that down a bit. You know, either maybe have day 0 and day 1 have things happen at the same time, or same with day 3 and day 2, and essentially just crunch down the timeline a little bit. So the way this is supposed to run is the players leave Stillwater, they go find the caravan. The caravan has clues that lead to the goblins, that lead up to the tower, as well as they can see the steading, or like see like signs of the steading not being too far. So they can either go to the steading to go ask questions, go deal with the goblins, or maybe even enroll them in their service, or go do recon on the tower. The issues that come in is that there's not like any random encounters that need to be done or anything like that. There's a lot of dudes in the tower, so they go and attack it, they're gonna die. I'll get into why there's issues with that later. It just sort of seems like the timeline is too long for the amount of content in the adventure. It feels like a mini sandbox, but not enough to do in it, which again, you can add a lot of stuff to it, add your own random encounters and everything else, but as somebody who's trying to run this by the book, the way somebody new might do it, because they're looking to the book to tell them how to do things, there were a lot of problems. So the way it ran for us, the players found the ruts of the wagons that lead north to the tower, so they knew that whoever was at the tower took the wagons. They also saw tracks that led south to the goblins, and they also saw the steading. What they decided to do was, well, we're here to get the grain, so we're going to go after the grain first. They get to that tower, they do some recon there. They split the party, and 2 went to the steading, and 2 stayed to watch the tower. At that time, I had bandits from the tower leave to go to the steading, because they were going to attack at some point anyway. So I thought, well, this is a good time. Now that they're split, this is like a good encounter where they're going to go meet some of the bandits, and then they're going to deal with them. So that went totally fine. That combat was great. There felt like there's a reason for that combat where they're protecting the steading as well as learning answers. They took one of the bandits hostage and then questioned them, and then they sort of figured out their game plan from there. Then they went south to the goblins, they parlayed with them, got them to help out, and they were bringing them to the tower, because now they knew that the tower was haunted, they knew the tower was full of people thanks to the person they were interrogating, and they knew they needed more than what they had. So they went back to Stillwater, they grabbed some more peasants to help them with the fight, they also went to the goblins, grabbed some goblins from there, and then they went to do an assault on the tower. They put all this time into thinking about it, they had different entry points, they did it at night, they had all these things, and then it just kind of turned into a slog. And the reason why it turns into a slog isn't even the number of bandits that are in there, but there's a lot. But it's because there's so many stat blocks split between them, which isn't overall a bad thing, but I don't think you need this many stat blocks. So in the tower, you have Otto, who has the bandit captain stat block. Then you also have 2 infamous bandits, who are like just a little bit worse. Then you have 10 veteran bandits, 10 bandits, and 15 peasants. So we have a total of 28 different people that are in the tower. And the reason why they have this number is so that they can't just immediately go and assault the tower. They will die if they do that. But this is way too much to keep track of, especially for just like what's supposed to be like a 1 or 2 shot. Because in that fight, we had the player characters. They had most of the goblins with them. They had the Rather Goblin stat block, and they also had the Mighty High Thune stat block, who was like just I think had the Mog stat block, if I'm not mistaken. And then I had all those stat blocks on the enemy side. So it was a shitload of different things. And again, I think you can fix this by just making it a little bit simpler. Firstly, remove those 15 peasants. I did. Either remove them or turn them into bandits. And then I would probably remove the veteran bandits and make them all just regular bandits. And then I would just maybe either remove some of those numbers and then add to the infamous bandit stat block. And I know I'm saying bandits losses is getting a little bit complex, but basically the way I would structure it is I would have the bandit captain auto. I would maybe have like 3 infamous bandits, and then if we want to keep the numbers somewhat similar, let's say 18 bandits total. I think that is a good enough force. Maybe 25 you want to really bump it up if you want that much. But I found with this number, it was ridiculous. So I did take 5 off of this final number because 5 of them left and then went to the setting. And you're supposed to do that. If any of them leave and do whatever else, take them away from this base number. And that's what I would do mostly just to make this less of a slog. If you want to keep this all the same, I would perhaps add a few more encounters with the bandits. Maybe even before they get to the caravan site that was attacked. You could have maybe like the 15 peasants and like 1 bandit who's like leading them. And he just sort of has them go and attack whoever as almost like a training exercise. Hey, you 15 stragglers want to join us, so you better show that you can actually do the job. Here's a group of people walking up the street. Go attack them. See if you survive. Do what you can. So you could have that encounter with like 1 bandit and like 15 peasants, and maybe that's a way to like, really cut down the numbers of what you're going to be dealing with in the end fight. My group, after the fight, the setting, and then staying there, they decided they were going to go parlay with the goblins. So if you had the same thing where the players go from the steading down to the goblins, or to the goblins first, what you could have is have a combat happening when the players arrive. And this is one way to remove some of the stat blocks. So you could have the goblins fighting maybe like the 15 peasants being led by like 5 bandits, whatever it might be. And you could throw in a big number like that because there's 8 goblin fighters and the Mighty Thune. So you add those guys with the players. That's a pretty even battle. Honestly, probably really in favor of the players because the peasants are really not great. And that way, when you do the final fight, you can remove like 15 to 20 different characters, or at least remove some of the stat block types that you're not dealing with them. Because when I did the final fight, I just removed the peasants anyway. I was like, fuck this. I already have all these bandits. I have these veteran bandits. I have the infamous bandits, and I have the bandit captain. On top of that, the players went from the top, which is where the ghosts are, which also you have the haunt stat block and the ghost stat block, so you throw those 2 onto there. So it gets really out of hand really fast. So that was one major issue. And the other major issue, going back to the schedule thing, like the timeline, is that the players attacked in my timeline before the bandits actually go to the town. Even though I think the town is both a more interesting place for the fight because of the intrigue of like what the bandits want, what they're doing with it, that they're not just there just to slaughter everybody, but they're actually there to like parlay and basically take over the town. So you could do that, plus you'd have the Harold Brewer guy who would help join the fight, who has that amazing stat block. So again, throw on another stat block on top of everything else you're dealing with, and it's also a really complex one. Or not a complex one, but it's like a really beefed up one, so you have a lot to do with it. But it is just more interesting. And my players actually felt like they did something wrong when they attacked the tower before that happened, because they went in the tower and they're like, what the fuck? How are we supposed to fight all these guys? This is crazy. This is such an insane endeavor. Did we do something wrong? Did we miss like a location that we're supposed to like get a way to deal with this? Like, it really made the players actually question, even though they did a really good job. They spent so much time planning. They spent so much time just, scraping every bit of information they could get from every location they were at. They did everything right, and they did basically as good as they could, but they still felt like they messed up, which is a very unsatisfying feeling. So the way the final encounter went was they had all the goblins with them, they had some extra peasants, they did all these stealth rolls to get by being noticed by anybody in the tower, they had one group go to the top, and they had one group go from the bottom, and once they went through the top, they immediately encountered the ghosts and went, well, fuck that, we're not doing this, and they went back down. All of them just fought from the front. It was a big slog, and basically what ended up happening was they went through and just started killing everybody they could. When the leader came down, they just all focused on him and just tried to get rid of him. They finally did kill him, and I essentially just had to be like, okay, everybody's obviously getting tired and frustrated, and they're just like looking at all these different tokens and stats on the table. Basically, the energy in the game was, holy shit, this is a slog. I feel like we did all this work, and it doesn't matter because they're just fighting everything, and it's getting pretty brutal. So let's just kill that leader, and hopefully they'll give up, which is what I ended up doing because we were getting down to, I think, about 4.5 hours of playtime at that point. So I was like, all right, you guys killed the leader. You guys killed a bunch of the dudes. They're just going to be like, all right, just let us leave. You'll never see us again, and we'll get out of here. And that's essentially how it ended, which is unsatisfying that, it could have gone from a really, really fun fight to this feels like a slog. One of my players was like, man, I can't believe you actually rolled for everything, which is true because I normally wouldn't do that, but I was like, but fucking rookie GM would go, I have to roll all these. My players will be mad if I don't roll all these. My players will be mad if I don't do the game as the game is supposed to be going, because a lot of rookie GMs feel like they need to go by what the rules say, which had the effect that all my players who are veterans of the hobby were kind of like, man, why are you rolling for fucking everybody? This is taking forever. What are you doing to us? So I did torture my players a little bit by doing that, but we did finally finish it. They ended up just being the heroes of the day, brought the grain back, and that was sort of just the end of it. And then I asked my players for what they thought. Overall, everybody was pretty positive about the system, but they did think the adventure itself was pretty rough. It just feels like this is like the first draft of part of a sandbox game, or the first draft of a smaller scenario. It could use some work, not even necessarily like extra meat on the bones. I think it has enough here as it is. I just think it needs to be rearranged, or maybe fleshed out just a little bit more. I think with the way it's laid out, it's this weird halfway point between a narrative game and a sandbox game. And I think it has some good elements. Like, I think the overall premise is really good. I think the overall investigation from the beginning is good. Yeah, this fun little intrigue at the beginning where is it the bandits who are doing this, or is it the goblins did this? What's happening in the area? Is it something bigger than that? But overall, it could use some work. So I would say if you are somebody who is looking to try out the system, modify it the way I said modify it, or modify it your own way. If you do modify it and run this in a way I said do it, please let me know how it works out. I am going to run this a few more times, so my opinion might change on my own off the top of my head modifications or the adventure itself, but right now it's pretty rough. It could use some work. So if anybody does run this, please let me know what you think, what your experiences were. I do think it'd be helpful to get ideas from other people, what they did to fix it, to make it a little bit better, because I do think it has some very solid bones. It just needs some more things add onto it. And I don't even mean necessarily content, I just mean just fixing the structure a bit. But that's pretty much it. That is the Shadow the Weird Wizard Quickplay. My final thoughts are that I do think Shadow the Weird Wizard is going to be a pretty good system. I am obviously biased because I am a huge Demon Lord fan. Shadow the Demon Lord is like this third in a trifecta of fantasy games for me. I basically have, DCC for DCC games because it's a very unique style of play. And a lot of the OSR stuff falls into DCC really well. I have Worlds Without Number for sandbox games because I've also started to have an idea that I don't think Worlds Without Number is great for one-shots, which I'll probably do either a podcast episode on or a video on, but it's great for sandbox games and that kind of open world gaming. And then I have Shadow the Demon Lord for my builds and narrative where we follow a big story and, a bit more of a heroic classic character. Shadow the Demon Lord, less so. Weird Wizard will probably have more of that classic D&D stuff, because as much as I shit on D&D, I do get in the mood sometimes for just classic, generic fantasy. Sometimes I just want that. Other times I do just want gong farmers getting their ass beat by monsters and that sort of stuff. But sometimes I'm in the mood for players making really fun builds and getting involved narratively and being people who do save the day. I feel like Demon Lord and hopefully Weird Wizard will fit that niche perfectly. So I kind of have all my fantasy bases covered with those three. I'm going to have an update video on how I feel about it when I have, a better idea of how the system itself is going to work more than what the Quick Play has. Because the PDFs should be out in the next few months, I think, because the book itself won't be out for a year. But when the PDFs for the core book and the GM book are out, I'm probably going to look over those. I might actually run a Weird Wizard campaign, maybe as an actual play, maybe just for my friends, and I'll just, come back with a breakdown or, a second impressions video, whatever it might be that would make sense for after I actually have some experience with the system itself. So these are my first thoughts on the Shadow the Weird Wizard Quickplay. I hope you found this helpful. I think there's going to be a lot of Weird Wizard content in the future on this channel. Anyway, that's all for today. I hope you guys have a good one and stay safe out there.